Hello. I'm Irina Mashina, host of this open studio. Lenin is once again in the spotlight. Politicians, historians, and audiences are discussing him. Those born in the Soviet Union likely remember Lenin from old films, where he was portrayed as a charismatic, vibrant figure, perhaps even superhuman. However, in the film Chronicles of the Russian Revolution, we saw a completely different Lenin, far from ideal, possessed of certain flaws, and constantly preoccupied with money. Why and how has Lenin's image changed in Soviet and Russian cinema? We'll discuss everything today with Doctor of Historical Sciences Nikolai Nikolaevich Platoshkin. He's here with us. Hello, Nikolai Nikolaevich.
Hello, Alina Anatolievna. Thank you for the invitation. I'd
like to remind you that Lenin's first role wasn't played by an actor. It was a worker, Vasily Nikondrav, whom Sergei Eisenstein discovered at the Putilov factory. And, by the way, he didn't need any makeup at all, because the resemblance was paradoxical. But then, there were complications with the actor for the role of Lenin. It was important that he didn't overshadow Stalin. And if you remember, in 37 and 39, Boris Shchukin played Lenin. But, besides the fact that actors for the role of Lenin were approved by the CPSU Central Committee, Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya also had her own voice. And so, she considered Boris Strauk, who played him in the film Man with a Gun, to be the best Lenin. So, which image of Lenin do you prefer? From which Soviet film? I'll
start with that Lenin really loved cinema. At the time, this was still something new, even saying that when he went into exile in Shushensko, he might have seen a film in Krasnoyarsk, but that's, so to speak, speculation. But in exile, he definitely went to the movies, watched them, and even wrote about them. And, he even said that the most important art for us was after the revolution. I haven't gotten to that yet. That is, Lenin refused to be filmed. Well, I mean, when he became head of the Soviet government, of course, all sorts of chroniclers flocked to him. He says that on May 1, 1918, he was filmed for the first time at a demonstration, but he refused to add an interview, saying, "You, comrades, go ahead and film." What does that have to do with me? That's why there isn't a single documentary with Lenin as the hero. Lenin nationalized the entire art of cinema in our country. That means movie theaters, film distributors, film studios. There weren't even any there yet. There were just groups of some kind of filmmakers who banded together. That's why, yes, he told Lunacharsky in 22, when they invited him, and said, "Now, cinema is important." The first film about Lenin wasn't made here. There were 2 Chekhovian features in Poland. Quote, "Thank God, it didn't survive." Probably about the same as what he's making now, right? As you rightly said, Igrovoy's first film about Lenin wasn't even about Lenin. Lenin is one of the figures of the decade. He appears there at the end, yes, of the October decade. Since the film isn't mine, he doesn't say anything. Yes, the decade of the October Revolution, everyone was there. Well, how can you make a film about the revolution without Lenin? Yes, indeed, Kostyomaz Nikodrov played that role, because everyone remembered Lenin very well back in 27. And indeed, Eisenstein said, "Here he is, yes, an ordinary worker." He worked after that. He didn't become some kind of movie star.
Well, he worked in the theater for a while.
Right? Well, I mean, he didn't exactly follow that path. Lenin's first film is so detailed, where Lenin is the main character. Yes, it's from the 1930s, A Man with a Gun. Lenin in October, Lenin in 1918. And one of the Maxim trilogies, the film Vyborskaya Strana, where Lenin, well, is the main character. There, of course, Stalin immediately appears, who, well, it seems, even sometimes gives Lenin a paternal pat, like, right? Krupskaya didn't like these films, with the exception of The Man with the Gun, because in those other films, Lenin, from her point of view, was somehow, like in the Konchalovskys now, kind of, so to speak, nervous. He says that Lenin was a living person, Krupskaya said, but it was never noticeable from some kind of, oh.
Yes. And even after that, Boris Strauk got a monopoly on the role of Lenin for 30 years. Thanks largely to Nadezhda Konstantinovna.
Many actors have played Lenin in our country, and Strauk and Kayrov have played them most often. And, by the way, I was surprised to look at Wikipedia today. Kayrov is apparently still alive. He was born in 1927.
He played Lenin 20 times.
And if he's alive, we wish him good health with all our hearts, because he's one of my favorite actors too. Before the war, the cinematic landscape was exactly like this. Lenin was some kind of
superhuman.
No, I wouldn't say so. No, he was kind of overly enthusiastic, or something, and, as Krupski noted, he didn't really resemble a statesman, whereas Stalin was the opposite. He, so to speak, after the war, you see, before Stalin's death, only 2 films about Lenin were made, and one of them was never released. Stalin personally killed him. Yupkovich's film, Light Over Russia, by the way, is a wonderful film. And it's well known that Lenin had a conversation with H.G. Wells. Stalin turned it down because he didn't like the role of Gelovayani, who played Stalin. Stalin had nothing to do with the fact that Gelovayani was there, and something just wasn't quite right. Yes, the State Commission gave absolutely wonderful reviews of this film, but it wasn't released. It was 1947, and then Lenin was made, well, in 1919, where Stalin had the lead role, and Lenin, well, helped him somehow. That was the first stage. Lenin was there, yes, a little. By the way, the films were very popular, I must say. They made money at the box office. Well, especially The Man with the Gun, that was a big moneymaker. Then after Stalin's death, the second stage began, the 1950s, and from 1953 onwards, 14 films were made. Well, if 2 were made after the war, 1 was not released, then 14 films were made before 1960. Again, the directors were basically the same, in many ways. Yupkovich, Roma, but Lenin was different.
You know, it reminded me of the film On the Same Planet. It was released in 1965, and Nikenty Skatunovsky played the lead role. He played an unusual Lenin, without a lisp or any fussiness. He was a different person.
But the 1960s were the peak of Soviet Leninism. 20 films were made, in my opinion, simply superb. You mentioned the one, On the Same Planet, with Maktunovsky in 1965. That same year, Yupkovich's brilliant film, Lenin in Poland, was released. Why brilliant? You know. He just won the Best Director award at Cannes. Well, you see, back then, Soviet films were given the thumbs up. Back when, well, it was impossible not to give them a thumbs up, because, well, the USSR, communism, Lenin, and On One Planet, the dawn of the new age, Lenin is shown there, well, a human country. He himself is shown there as a thinker, not just a political thinker, but a man full of some kind of experiences. I would say, he is shown there as a romantic. Well, not a tragedian, but a romantic who truly sincerely believes in what he does. And his simplicity is shown, which he truly possessed. Well, that is, not like with the armored car and all that, but Yupkovich actually invented Lenin in Poland, a truly brilliant genre. This is a film in which Lenin is the main narrator. That is, Lenin is not someone else talking about Lenin, or some heroes, you know, which was logical in the past. No, Lenin himself narrates about himself off-screen. Well, Nadia and I went there. So, we had some people there. He even touches on the topic of Lenin's childlessness cautiously, saying, well, they became attached to a girl while living in Poland, she had a fiancé, she was Polish, and so, well, he says, God didn't give us children, but we somehow became attached to these people, and they really did treat them. It was a real fact, like a father and mother, because they somehow helped there, basically, they tried. Well, that's how Lenin is portrayed absolutely, so to speak, a man who isn't always confident, you know, hesitant, but never loses sight of his main goal. That's why, in Cannes, I think I imagine myself, everyone was simply stunned, seeing Lenin, whom, well, no one even. And in the film, where Skatunovsky plays the lead role, one day is described, just one. Yes, look at how Lenin shows up at a work party with Nadezhda Konstantino, how he's embarrassed to dance, how there's an assassination attempt on him. It's just one day, from December 31st, 1917, to January 1st. And by the way, the assassination attempt really did happen, and it was a party. And there, it would seem, well, yes, Smoktunovsky is now making all the difference with his makeup. So what kind of Lenin is Smoktunovsky? Yes, he's supposed to be some intellectual from Ryazanovsky, beware of the car. No, back then, the actors were truly spiritually transforming themselves into Lenin. That's primarily the director's work, of course. Have
you seen the play Blue Horses on Red Grass at the Lincoln Theater? Oleg Yankovsky plays Lenin there, without a bald head or makeup. And in my opinion, it's a very interesting portrayal, very profound, and much deeper than anything we've seen before. This isn't an icon, this isn't an ideal, this isn't some kind of alien devoid of human traits, but at the same time, this is a man who could be among us. And so Lenin's image transformed. He became closer to an ordinary person. And it all culminated in the film Demon Revolution, in which Mironov played Lenin. A very controversial role. I prefer not to watch historical films about us, our country, after 1991. I tried to do that. Well, you see, we were already raised in Soviet times with a certain taste. I'm not saying it correctly, Lenya, no, but there has to be some kind of taste, I don't know, some kind of minimum standards or something. Well, look, Mironov writes in one of his interviews, I specifically found it. I was interested in that period of Lenin's life, the pre-revolutionary period. And Lenin is interesting in his human manifestations, how he didn't show his enormous desire to break through Germany to Russia, how he behaved in his relationships with his women. He firmly decided on armament. This is a comrade from the district family. I wanted to uncover many new facts. Did he succeed or not?
And what kind of Lenin were his women? What is this? What kind of new fact is this? I don't know, for example, but, you could say this. Let's study Pushkin only from the point of view of who he slept with, right? Well, and poetry, as time goes on, yes. Of course, Lenin didn't have any women, except for Krupska, and frankly speaking, he couldn't have. It's simply by his nature that he couldn't betray his wife, you see, even in such things. Well, it's simply out of the question, not because I'm defending him there. It's just that people have certain, moral principles. Mironov, apparently, doesn't understand this, right? He thinks that if a skirt flashes by somewhere, you have to seize the opportunity. That's what I'm saying. People are filming about Lenin who are, 100 orders of magnitude inferior to him. Rom Yutkovich, they themselves were very multifaceted personalities. So, Mironov, who is Mironov? Let him not be offended. What kind of Lenin is he? Well,
later, Andrei Makhov, Alexander Filipenko, Viktor Sukharuk also played Lenin. Sukharukov,
especially Sukharukov.
Incidentally, Sukharukov, I think, created the most unsuccessful image of Lenin. Alexander Kolyagin and Yevgeny Stichkin also played him.
Kolyagin also played Lenin during the Soviet era, right?
But Nikolai Gabenko was rejected and not approved for the role of Lenin during the screen test. Boris Galkin and Oleg Tabakov were rejected. Leonid Bronovoy, who played Lenin in the theater, was also rejected. Well, that's all our Lenin baggage. Now it's got something new to say. What are your impressions of Yevgeny Kachuk's performance of Lenin in Chronicles of the Russian Revolution? He's played many successful roles. He plays Melikov in Quiet Flows the Don, a rather successful role. And Kachuk also played the jester in The King and the Jester. I think he did a great job with that role. As Sterla said, I always remember the last thing, but I always pay attention to the first. So, Lenin's first appearance in the film Chronicles of the Russian Revolution, Lenin's first appearance, Lenin is riding with his comrade and says, "How can we get more money?" Well, for Kachuk, it's probably close. I don't know, maybe, yes, how can we get more money? And then we have to demand money from Parvis, and money constantly appears there. But was money really that important for the revolution, and what was it needed for?
Yes, Lenin was a man in this sense, as it were, absolutely free from all this. Lenin, as a thinker, he valued some kind of minimal comfort. What was Nadezhda Konstantino supposed to do in rented apartments? He never had a place to live. He never had his own place, although he was the head of the government, as you understand, right? That is, the task was a table, lamps, because in the evening, yes, back then, not everyone had electricity. And, to ventilate the rooms, increasingly larger, actually, yes, and plus they rented apartments, as a rule, there in Paris, next to the library, so he wouldn't have to spend money on transportation. Yes, he walked. More than him, actually, in terms of comfort. This doesn't mean he and Nadezhda Konstantino loved walking. Why? Because that was the cheapest way to spend time. Of course, they didn't have their own car either. Well, they rode bicycles, because they rented them. Yes, That was already the case in Europe back then. He even recalled that once they decided to take a vacation in the mountains because Krupska had Bazit's disease. Not because of him. He walked and, well, he just wanted her to feel better. That is, at first, they had a kind of party diet, well, that is, the salary, it was such that you couldn't even rent an apartment on it, even Lenin wrote something, and he wasn't above writing reference books and articles. For example, there was Marx's anniversary, and he was commissioned to write some article about Marx, yes, he wrote it. And it said that Nadezhda Konstantino's mother was also the widow of some, state councillor. The three of them always lived together. Her mother ran the household. She received some kind of assistance. Lenin's mother also sent them money. And not only that, but the widow of a state councillor sometimes sent food here and there. For example, they received smoked fish there. And then, you see, they died and received a small inheritance from Nadezhda Konstantinovna's mother. And practically all of it went towards Nadezhda Konstantino's operation, because she had surgery, otherwise she would have simply died. And Lenin at that time writes, "I'm ready to take on just, well, any job, because he's a good doctor, but he charges a lot of money." The operation was indeed performed, she survived, and, well, the illness remained, yes, but there was no longer a threat to her life, it seemed.
And how did he live abroad with the money? She
sent them money, apparently. Money. Vladimir Ilyich's mother died in 1916. Before that, she sent money, and Nadezhda Konstantinovna's mother, who also lived with them, sent and received her pension.
Well, in the film, everything is presented differently. He comes to St. Petersburg, and it's very interesting how Stalin lines up armed sailor workers. And Lenin asks, "Won't they kill us?" Quote.
Well, why make this up? I can't understand. Because, you see, there are already a lot of memories of Lenin at that time. You understand? This man was already so serious, and a lot of memories from the enemies have also been preserved. That's why Lenin came when he came to St. Petersburg. Well, it would seem that the Germans sent him. He was met by the entire leadership of the Petrograd Soviet, but at that time, the Mensheviks were the parliament. He was still popular among the workers, but among the socialists, you would meet an ordinary emigrant, the leader, so to speak, of Russia at that time. As for the honor guard, Stalin has nothing to do with it either. It's just that, in some military units of the Petrograd garrison, the Bolsheviks were popular. In some places, not. This was the armored division, where there were the most, well, advanced people at that time. They all followed the Bolsheviks and the sailors sent an honorary ship. This armored division. Regarding money. Sometimes it seems to me that in this film, Lenin is presented as some kind of gangster. I'm talking about the scene in the film when he comes to Parvis, who refuses to give him the money, and Lenin gives the order to cut off Parvis's finger and starts grabbing some of his favorite things. What is this? It's fiction overcoming reality. Well, it's just some kind of nonsense, because they met after the start of the First World War once, on Parvos's initiative, in Switzerland, because Parvos actually went there on assignment from the German General Staff, to recruit some people among the Russian rebels. And like these friends, he started finding out where Lenin was. He was told they were in Krupskaya, and that he and Krupskaya always had lunch in the student cafeteria. This is about money. Well, you can find it there with the students. He found it there. After which, you see, Lenin threw him out and wrote an article of the last resort, where he called the couple, Salaki, licking Hindenburg's boots, from the then head of the German General Staff, and said that it was impossible to have anything to do with him at all. The most interesting thing is, you see, well, you could say, well, it doesn't matter what he wrote there. When the revolution happened, Parvor burst into Russia. He
wanted to be the Minister of Finance in the government.
Yes, and an advisor, well, someone, yes, because he approached Trotsky, but he was harshly rejected. And look, well, from the point of view of the sale. Oh, bastards, you turned me down. Now I'm going to tell everyone everything about you. Yes, well, he published a couple of pamphlets, that Kerensky is an idiot, and the point is this. Not only did I not give money to Lenin, but, he says, I can't even imagine that I could offer him this. He writes all this pars. If he was offended by the Bolsheviks, and he was offended because they did not appreciate him, then he would have spilled it all. True.
Peros was also Gorky's agent, as far as I know, and Parvis didn't always spend the money Gorky earned for its intended purpose. Lenin knew this and therefore, apparently, didn't want to ruin his reputation or have close ties with him.
He never had any ties with him, anyway. Where did they even get that from?
That is, this line in the film Parvis Lenin is entirely fiction.
He met him once more, when he came to Geneva and somehow wanted him, so to speak, and they never met again. This was in 1915, the beginning of 1915, April or something like that, I think. And Parvos, you see, he was a crook, really. He came to the Germans and said that for 1,000,000 marks he would organize a revolution in Russia in January of 1916. They gave him 1,000,000, and didn't believe him, but they said 1,000,000, like, let's go. He'll try. Well, that is, he, roughly speaking, swindled the Germans out of money and then simply made money. How? He lived in neutral Copenhagen, and was involved in smuggling. That is, he supplied goods from Germany to Russia, to countries at war, and from Russia to Germany, and made a fortune from this. But what does Lenin have to do with this? What, was Lenin ever in Copenhagen, even once? I don't know. Well, what kind of nonsense is this? The
second point in the film also alarmed me. I know that some Tsarist officers were against the provisional government and thus supported the Bolsheviks. But in the film, all of this is presented. The October Revolution is presented as a special operation by white officers, followed by the working masses. This is also fiction. Reality prevailed.
There was the Petrograd Soviet, a completely legal body. From September 1, 1917, it was led by the Bolsheviks. On September 1, Trotsky was elected chairman, that is, he was the head of parliament, so to speak. The provisional government was subordinate to the Petrograd Soviet. And Red Guard detachments were created completely legally at every factory. They were given weapons from the garrison to defend the revolution from the impending German offensive. They thought the Germans would attack. That is, by November 7, all Petrograd garrison units were again subordinate to the Petrograd Soviet. Which officers? What are we talking about? I mean, even those Trotskys were saying, maybe we shouldn't arrest the provisional government, but they were like, we cut off their phones anyway, and they're like, well, two governments formed a new one. And who convened the provisional government? The Congress of Soviets. Well, the Congress of Soviets, which proclaimed Lenin Prime Minister, head of the Council of People's Commissars, was conceived before the revolution. He was the second. The first was in June of 1917, where Lenin was also present. Well, that is, a parliament assembled, roughly speaking, yes, one government did not present a provisional government, which, by the way, no one elected at all. Yes, and a new Council of People's Commissars elected. What's so surprising about that? I can't understand. And what do white officers have to do with it? If, you see, it was a military operation, what did it consist of? When, in fact, Antonov Avsenko arrived in trucks to arrest the provisional government, they simply walked into the Winter Palace. The provisional government was dining on fish, Antonov Avsenko arrived with Reichsocks, and the group with him. All this is preserved. Even in the description of the provisional government they say, who are you anyway? What? That's it. The Congress has elected a new government, goodbye. We protest. Quote, well, wonderful. They were sent to the Peter and Paul Fortress again. Why? Because it was, I think, already 10 a.m. The trams weren't running, the bridges were raised. Where are you going now? He says. They were sent to the nearby Peter and Paul Fortress. They spent the night there and went their separate ways. That's all.
You know, I'm surprised that such a master of cinema as Andrei Sergeyevich Konchalovsky ignored, as far as I know, the historian's conclusion. I'm talking about Yegor Nikolaevich Yakovlev now. He said that Konchalovsky himself contacted him and sent him all 16 episodes of the script. He read them in St. Petersburg, gave his critical comments, stated that he explained in detail that it completely deviated from the historical facts, but none of his comments were taken into account, so he categorically refuses to be credited as a historical consultant or assistant, because his comments were ignored.
Well, the director has the right to do that. Well, just say so. Excuse me, but you don't need to mention me in the credits, since you disagreed with me. You know, it's good here, it's good there. The film is bad, but I'm in the credits. No, that doesn't happen.
Well, there are two people there. Regarding Yegor Nikolaevich Yakovlev, everything is clear. He doesn't deny that he read it, that he gave his negative critical opinion. Anatoly Spitsin is also mentioned there.
Well, maybe Konchalovsky knows. I couldn't find this person who is mentioned there at all. It's Vladislav Listov. I couldn't find such a historian. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can suggest such a history. I should ask Konchalovsky. He probably knows what credits he included, right?
I spoke with Andrei Sergeyevich twice. The first time he said, yes, indeed, Yevgeny Yurievich Spitsin. I contacted Yevgeny Gerevich Spitz, but he read it, made a few comments, then called me back and said, well, most likely, it was a friendly gesture. Yes, he was simply providing me with advice. Yevgeny Yurievich, in turn, believes that he claims his comments weren't taken into account, which is why he's not in the credits.
Again, look at the meaning. It can be friendly, it can be by agreement, it doesn't matter. Simply, if you want to be involved with this film as a consultant formally, it doesn't matter. Then you give permission, please, you can mention me. If you think the film is bad, well, that is, it doesn't correspond to what you, well, then say this, please don't mention me. Well, who can put me in the credits, books, films without my consent? Come on, what are you saying? Well, that's not right. Then call me and tell them, please, remove me from the credits. This is being done, you know, you're on TV in 5 minutes, if you want. But it turns out I'm in the credits, and I'm basically against it, right? What's that? I'm
thinking about something else now. Why did this concept of Lenin's image come about? First, look, we had the film Mummy on the Spaz TV channel. Now Kachuk plays some gangster in the film Chronicles of the Russian Revolution. And all of this is being broadcast on the state-owned VGTRK channel itself. And, mind you, everything connected to the revolution is shown in a negative light. Whatever it is, it's either money, or some kind of theft, or prostitution, or corruption. And the film, it seemed to me, gave off a whiff of this imperial idea. What was your impression? Maybe this is some kind of new reading of history? It's just that, you see, they're still afraid of Lenin, because what is connected to Lenin? Natural modesty, restoring a minister's salary to no higher than a worker's. And that's how Lenin got by. Absolute disregard for material goods, despite owning, well, a country a sixth of the world's size, when he treated people and said, today is a holiday, look, I have some jam. You see? Well, how are they going to tolerate all this, wallowing in luxury? There are 100 houses there, I don't know, and something else there, of which, as the Germans told me, we ordered your yacht, he said, with railings made of Tyrannosaurus bones. These are today's oligarchs.
right. Well, can you imagine Lenin in that role? Lenin had a communal apartment in the Kremlin. Well, that is, they had a shared kitchen, I think, with Sirupa, or something, and, excuse me, a toilet. And in St. Petersburg, before he arrived, he was still living in his mother's room, in a 5-room apartment where his sister and her husband lived. He and Krupskaya huddled there. So, here we are, sitting in an office, well, about a third of the room, maybe, was Krupskaya's, there was a screen there, that's all, basically, the entourage. And what about them? You see, they need to tarnish Lenin's image, to say something like, why are you bothering us? Oh. Look at what he did. There's also some nonsense about Stalin participating in an attack on some banks. I'm interested, let them name the bank, at least the time and everything. And what? Lenin took money. Okay, how much, from whom, when are their receipts? And look, a lot of documents from Parvas have survived about who he gave it to and who he took it from. There's nothing secret about it. He was just playing the fool for the Germans, you see. They said, when the revolution failed in January, he said, give us another 3.5 million. And that's it. And we'll do it. There was no corruption under Lenin. Well, no one has proven it, at least not yet. Well, they were susceptible, right?
So we're saying the imperial family was susceptible to corruption. And on the other hand, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, didn't have anything good either. But what can we rely on? Who?
Well, I rely on the Bolsheviks. Why? Because the Bolsheviks personally gave me free education, free healthcare. My parents were given a free apartment, which they still live in. They gave them an 8-hour workday, Pensions were given to women at 55 and men at 60. The Bolsheviks gave all this. The Tsar, my grandmother, remembered him, well, not him personally, but in life. She couldn't remember anything good at all, like an ordinary village peasant woman. I think Mr. Yuzmanov, well, it's better to ask him, of course. Yes, he decided to bow to the authorities, saying that I, my bourgeois self, am ready to vulgarize Lenin without any questions.
Still, why do you think this film appeared now? Is it some kind of new view on history, a new reading? Is something changing in our ideology?
Well, rumors are circulating, you see, persistently, I must say, that they want to remove Lenin from the mausoleum. He needs to be discredited before that. Yes, naturally, so that people will be outraged. But what about him? Yes, indeed, he's already such a terrible jerk there, and so on. And again, there's a deeper reason. He's preventing them from living by his example. You understand, he lived completely differently as the leader of the country, and he holds all that is dear to them.
So you think the only reason is the idea of removing Lenin from the mausoleum?
There's another deeper reason. They hate him as an antipode. The reason is in between. They need to remove the monuments, rename the streets, and remove the main monument, yes, the mausoleums. Well, and then, as they think, people will forget all of this, and in the end, there will be
no talk of restoring the empire.
Well, what kind of empire, you know?
The Russian one?
And how did your empire collapse in one day? Exactly. Well, the February Revolution. Women made it, after all. Women. And what is it like? And Hitler couldn't do anything with us. All of Europe was under him, with the exception of England, and he couldn't do anything. In that sense, that was an empire. The whole nation became as one.
Well, that film, it's also something of an action movie. Lenin is like some kind of gangster there, I can imagine, yes.
You know, in reality, if you want to make an action movie about Lenin, yes, he had a life like that. Can you imagine him pulling a grain out from under the ice in the Gulf of Bothnia? Isn't that an action movie? When he was hiding in the floodplain, we'll try to figure out what happened later, when he was returning, remember, with his cheek bandaged so he wouldn't be recognized on the train, because there was an arrest warrant, and he was walking. A patrol of cadets even stopped him. Well, he had an escort with him. He's a Finn. He doesn't understand any Russian, because they were afraid that if Lenin opened his mouth, they would recognize him by his voice. Well, I mean, not even by his voice, but by his manner, yes. Now that's action, you see. The man really did risk his life many times, and he risked his life not for the Côte d'Azur. Yes, he would have stayed there. And what if he hadn't, precisely for his country, without which he couldn't even imagine himself?
Well, for some reason, we don't get funding for films like that.
Well, we should simply respond to that with a good film of our own, with good actors. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Lenin quoting, I don't know, some party resolutions. No, let's make a film about Lenin the man in the style of Yutkovich and Gabrilovich. Let's commit ourselves, dear communists and all who sympathize with us. It's easy to do.
Well, I'd like to hope that a revolutionary situation will pass us by, and that our viewers are intelligent and educated enough to have their own opinion about our national history, which we can be quite proud of. Our program is over. You can find all the news and analysis on the Free Press. Stay with us, you won't regret it.
Thank you. Goodbye.